Good morning. All right, works well. So, good morning. I hope you all enjoyed the festivities last night. Too bad for the Cats. We were kind of hoping they'd pull through on that win. But I'm Carla Raisler, and today I'm going to talk about the autism spectrum and how neurodiversity is good for our industry and how we can be better communicators with our teams. So as you can see from the title of my talk, this comes from my experience with my son, Drake, who's 10 years old. He's on the spectrum. So what that's taught me over the last 10 years is different communication styles. As he grew up, what I realized was that I had a lot of team members that were very similar to him. And it changed the way that I communicated with those folks. And it led me to do a lot of research on the subject. And so I think I've become a better team leader from that because I understand that there's different ways. Everybody requires a different kind of communication set. And supporting neurodiversity in that workplace really gives us the ability to have more innovative teams. So I really like this quote because I thought it was pretty appropriate for this group. Autism is not a processing disorder, it's a different operating system. So a lot of times when I look at my son, he's on he's on Mac OS Leopard, and I'm running on Windows 95. And so there is that difference in processing, and that really relates to our coworkers as well. So it is a structural variation. Autism is a structural variation in the brain's architecture, and that neurodiversity gives us the ability to be divergent in the ways that we think and how we're able to approach and solve problems. So I kind of think about my teams now as more of like a heterogeneous network where we've got some folks operating on Mac systems and some folks operating on Windows systems, and it's my job to kind of figure out what the protocols are so that we can communicate to each other. I have to admit, I've rewritten this presentation multiple times over the last couple of months. For me, it was very difficult to find the words to properly discuss a group of people that I'm not necessarily a member of that community. And each time that I would have somebody listen to my presentation, they would say, talk less about the spectrum and more about the people. So I really tried to pull back on a lot of the science. I had a tendency to keep trying to put in a lot of science into it and talk about the history and the terminology, and I had to resist that urge and pull back. And so really what I'm trying to do is talk about how to be more inclusive and how to be able to communicate better with our teams. So before that then, this is my disclaimer slide, because we got to use language, and words are important, and especially when it comes to this particular community. So what I'm going to say is based on the people in my life. Those are my friends, my coworkers, and my family. I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a psychologist. There's a lot of different words and terminology that we use when we talk about people on the spectrum. And so first and foremost, we're all unique and differently challenged individuals. So are autists. And so the saying goes, if you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Because we are all very different. There are some similarities for folks that are on the spectrum, the same way there are some similarities for us neurotypicals. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So it is a spectrum disorder, but that also means that it encompasses more than just autism. We talk about dyslexia, ADHD, OCD. These are all neurodivergent types that when you come to work, you've grown up with that, you come to work, so you require different communication styles. I have one coworker who's ADHD, and that guy will squirrel on me in a second, right? So, and it took me a while to understand that it wasn't something that I was doing. It was that I needed to figure out how to be able to redirect him back to me. And once I got through that, it was easier to communicate, because it's not that he's doing it on purpose, it's just how his brain is wired to do things. And so when I recognize that, I can say, hey, can we come back to this subject? Or we haven't finished this conversation yet. I don't like the definition of, I don't like the word disorder, but it's So it's a medical definition, right? And so I was like, well, what does disorder really mean? Disorder is a physical or mental condition that is not normal or healthy. I said, well, so what's normal? Well, the medical definition of normal is conforming to a type, standard, or regular pattern. Well, based on that, none of us are normal, right? So, but my son in particular, when he's at home, he is normal and healthy because there are no other 10-year-olds to compare him to. So he's normal at home, but he is autistic at school because he does have a different pattern there. And so what I did is I translated that from working with him to the way that I work with my coworkers as well. So my coworkers, I don't compare them to each other. Each person is an individual, and they come with different strengths, they come with different challenges. So the important thing is that I judge them based on the characteristics, the capabilities that they have. And that helps me be able to throttle how I push people, how I communicate with them. I'm in the military as well, so there are folks that I can talk very directly to because I have a very direct style. But now I understand that there are people that isn't necessarily the best communication method for them. So I have to dial that back when I talk to them. And people appreciate that differently. So I have my preferred communication style, but if I want to be able to communicate with you, I have to understand what your preferred communication style is. So we talk about the difference between neurodiversity and neurodivergent. So, it's a new paradigm, and with new paradigms comes new language. So the term neurodiversity really started showing up in the late 1990s, and it's not a trait that an individual has. Diversity is a trait possessed by a group, not an individual. When an individual diverges from that dominant societal standard of normal, when we talk about neurocognitive functioning, they don't have neurodiversity, they are neurodivergent. And that's important when we start to talk about the difference between neurodiversity in the workplace and being able to encompass all of the different types of different processing that we go through. So let's talk about neurotypicals for a minute, right? So neurotypical is generally a term for anybody who thinks, perceives, or behaves in a way that we consider to be normal by the general population. It has there's no medical or psychological meaning to it. It's something that we've come up to talk about the other group, right? So we've got the neurodivergent and we have neurotypicals, and we call those folks NTs, or people sometimes refer to them as normies, right? So let's talk about NTs before we talk about folks on the spectrum. So here are some quotes that I've found off of sites, blogs of folks that are neurodivergent. And when you look at these quotes, they're accurate. I absolutely have an obsessive compulsion to societal norms. I have an inability to focus on a topic of interest. I have this absurd need to stare in people's eyeballs, right? So that's true, but you would never actually say that about me. Instead, you would say that I'm a type A, outgoing person who enjoys communicating and connecting with folks. When you turn that language around, you begin to see just how ridiculous it can sound when you talk about folks that are on the spectrum the same way. Nobody's putting on a 5K for me because I'm an NT. And so we have to think about how we refer to folks. So and it's got to be difficult, I imagine, if you have to work with me all day and you are the opposite side of that spectrum as me, I could probably be pretty annoying, and it probably takes a lot of energy for you to make it through the day with somebody like myself who constantly wants to communicate and constantly wants to know what's going on. And so I have to remember to kind of calm it down, relax, and understand that we're all different. So I told you I wouldn't get too far into the history, but to me, the history is important because you have to understand where we are. And a lot of this comes in the stigma that's still related to autism spectrum disorder, and why there are people who don't want to, especially a lot of undiagnosed adults who still today choose to hide that side of them and be able to blend in. And they do that because of the stigma. And when we look at the history of, it's a short history. So in 2013 is when the DSM created the term autism spectrum disorder, and pushed away Asperger's. So a lot of people still like to be referred to as Aspies, and that's okay. So we're changing, the language is still changing as we go. But if you think about it, in 1991 is really when public schools finally recognized it as a special education needs. So a lot of the people that we work with didn't have the resources available to them when they were younger to be able to have those therapies. They were still trying to figure out what it was, how to respond to it. My son's been in pretty intense therapy since he was 3 years old. And that's not something, if I'd had him, if we were in 1991, he wouldn't have been able to be mainstreamed into school. And today, he has an individual education plan. He has aides that walk through with him and help him with his transitions. Those things have really helped him be able to mainstream and become successful and learn a lot of social skills along the way. And really, for him, it's kind of like acting, but he's figuring it out. Sometimes he'll tell me, so I'm very sarcastic, and that's difficult for somebody on the spectrum to get. But now he knows, I'll say something, and he'll look at me. He says, "Mom, are you being sarcastic?" And I say, "Yes, I am." That's very good of you to be able to pick up on that. Do you like sarcasm? He says, "I find it useless." But now he gets it. And that's really important when you're having social interactions with people, to be able to get that kind of communication, even if it's not something that you want to participate in. And so we're kind of getting off topic, but the 80s and 90s is where we started to get some kind of real therapy out there. It's really started to take shape. But then we also had things like the study that showed that vaccines were related, caused autism. And while that study has been completely debunked, it really left that stigma stay there. I'm sure everybody in this room knows somebody who thinks that vaccines cause autism, and that's unfortunate. And it really created, it made it so that there was still stigmatized. People still don't want to be able to, people still have a hard time expressing that they are on the spectrum because they feel like there's still negative connotation to that. And there really isn't. It just means that we have a different way of operating. Because if you think about it, in the 60s in the 60s, some of the therapies used were LSD, electric shock. It was so horrible, and that's like within our lifetime. There's people in this room that's in our lifetime, is that we were treating folks on the spectrum with LSD and electric shock. So you can see why people still don't want to talk about being on the spectrum, and it makes it that I still know parents whose young children are on the spectrum and they choose not to go get them diagnosed because of the stigma that's associated with it. And unfortunately, that means that they don't get the resources that are available as well. And adults, I have some friends who choose to go undiagnosed because they feel like it would negatively impact their job. And that's unfortunate, because if we are able to identify that, it makes it easier to get the resources that we need and provide that information. And so if you look back, you got Hans Asperger, 1938. So that's really when we kind of modernized the idea of autism, and that's really not that long ago. So it's still changing. I think we're doing a really great job now. There's a lot of companies that are out there that are supporting our neurodivergent community and helping with job placements, because even though we've gotten this far, we still have a lot further to go. But when we look at the potential for excellence, so one of the things that we can do now is we can go back into history and look at some of the amazing people that have changed the landscape for this world and identify that, you know what, that person was probably on the spectrum. And so when we pull up, when we start to look at it, it's artists, it's poets and authors and film directors and storytellers and actors and actresses, and of course, my favorite, scientists. And it's amazing when we look, they have changed this world, and they're going to continue to change this world. So your coworkers, your family members, all of those folks that are in your life have this great potential that if we embrace, we can help with that innovation going forward. But there's a lot going on in the spectrum. And so while we look back and we say, wow, Tesla was awesome, and Darwin and all these folks, they made great contributions to this world, but they also had their issues that they had to deal with, and we have to recognize that there is a lot going on there. So, sleep disturbances, epilepsy, apraxia, like those things people have to work through. Now, we all kind of develop at different rates. And so when I was a kid, I took speech therapy classes when I was in elementary school. And then I was behind educationally. So I went to I had language problems and math problems. And then eventually, I caught up, and then I went ahead and got past that. So we all develop at different times, and there are different comorbidities of symptoms that can make it difficult for us to be able to work through those. So why do I say this? Because adolescence is hard, right? So when we think about our coworkers and where they came from, if you're on the spectrum and you have some social anxiety issues, some communication problems, now you take that plus what it's like to just be an adolescent, right? Friends, school, sports, all of that combined is really what has made the individual who is currently on your team the person that they are. And so I know that my adolescence affected who I am as an adult, and everybody's does. And so we have to think about the fact that a lot of folks had a really difficult adolescence. I kind of mama bear my kid a little bit more than my daughter. My daughter's 23. She's neurotypical. And so when she worked through her bully problems in school and this and that, it was, kind of toughen up kind of situation. And she's just fine. But my son, when I see him playing with a group of people, and all of a sudden the group doesn't understand what he's trying to do because he's not understanding what they're trying to do, my chest starts to puff up, and I want to go over there right away and stop whatever's happening. Now with my team members as well, I may mom them just a little bit, but I want to be protective because I understand that it's difficult for them to catch on to what's going on in that organization or what's going on in that conversation, and I want them to feel safe and respected, and so that they trust me to make sure that they can do the best job that they can do, and they can be the best person that they can be. Because people have this great range of capabilities, but the general experience of people with ASD is that finding and keeping a job or career is not as easy for neurotypicals. And so we still have a lot of data out there that shows that it is difficult for somebody on the spectrum, more difficult for them to keep and sustain a career. I think we're starting to do better, but a lot of that really requires that an individual is able to feel secure and safe and say that, hey, I am on the spectrum. These are some of the additional resources I need. If somebody is in my office and they require a wheelchair, it's pretty easy, right? I give them a wheelchair, or I don't give them the wheelchair, but they come in, we make sure they have a handicap parking spot, we make sure that they're able to get into the building, we accommodate their need for them. The problem with ASD is that it's not physical, and so it makes it difficult for us to recognize that there are some accommodations that need to be made. And a lot of that comes down to team building. So team building is something that helps me get our team to communicate. And one of the things we have to make sure of when we do team building is that we don't turn it into mandatory fun, right? So I'm in the military, we do mandatory fun a lot, and there's nothing fun about mandatory. And make sure that the individuals are actually part of the planning process, because they may not want to go to Six Flags and ride roller coasters. So don't get the happiest, bubbliest person on the team to always be making the team building events. Some of ours are as simple as pizza and funny YouTube videos. But we have to do that so that they learn to be able to, so I do it so that they can trust me more and communicate more. Because one of the things with communication is that just this past week, I had an individual who, he wrote me in the morning and he said, I'm sick, I'm gonna talk to HR about sick days, can we reschedule our meeting? And I said, yeah, sure, go ahead, no problem. And I walked by his desk a couple hours later and he's there. And I said, Sean, what are you doing? You're sick. And he says, he said, they told me that we don't have sick days. We don't have sick days. We just stay home and either work from home or stay in bed. But the HR person didn't understand how to communicate that properly, so he took it as, I just got to come into work. I said, hold on. And so I go over, get the HR person. I said, you need to go explain what we do for sick days because he's here and he's sick and he needs to go home. So really it's talking about that. And again, that comes down to nurturing. Like I mentioned, I do tend to be a little bit more protective. A lot of that comes from my experience with my son, and it's made me a better person when it comes to working with my coworkers and my team members. And really it's just about you can be a champion for your employers or your employees and your team members. I had somebody with sensory issues, and it took a while to figure out why he kept asking to have his desk moved. And the bosses are like, no, he's fine. Well, it turned out it was a sensory issue because he was in a high traffic zone with bright fluorescent lights, and it was causing him to have headaches and making it difficult for him to work. And once I was able to work through with him what that root cause of that problem was, then we could go ahead and move on. I got his desk moved, was able to get him into a better spot so that he can work better and be more successful. And so I love root cause analysis, and that's something I've really learned to do, especially when you have children who can't communicate very well, because you have to stop and look around and figure out what in the environment is causing them discomfort. And so that, again, has led me to do that same thing with my team members, which is sometimes they can't really communicate well enough to explain what's going on, but if I take the time to do the root cause analysis, like the desk and the sensory issues, then I can pinpoint what's happening and get them into a better space, just like I would provide somebody with a wheelchair ramp if they needed to get to their desk and there were steps there. So it's really just figuring that out, and sometimes people have more difficulty communicating their needs than other folks. I will tell you exactly what I need, but that's because I'm a very direct person. Not everybody's that way, and so it really takes time to understand them. So we talk about this community, working in a diverse community. DerbyCon is a great example. Part of this talk came to me after being here last year and seeing the diversity in the community here. And I think a lot of people choose to come here because they can be embraced for whoever it is that they are. And I think people go out of their way to be extra nice here at DerbyCon. I have, if I need to go to dinner, I just plug in the Slack, put in the Slack channel, hey, who's going to dinner? And I've spent evenings with groups of people that I had never met before, had never talked to before, and I find even myself to be a little bit nicer because I want to be giving back. Make sure, local groups now, there's lots of different groups that you can join. There's a teenage autism group in Lexington that my son will get to be part of when he gets a little bit older, so that way he's in that same community. And then lastly, blogs and books. One of the ways that I really learned to communicate with my son and my teams is reading blogs from folks that are on the spectrum. So there's another mantra, which is nothing about us without us. And so it's really important to get their perspective. One of them is Look Me in the Eyes. The book was great. And it really, I could see some of the same attributes in my son that I was reading in these books. And it helped me, because this is a very difficult topic to talk about, because it's difficult to talk about people, especially when you don't belong to that particular group. So Nick Walter is a great blog where you can read about somebody who has direct firsthand experience with it. So I think my time is up. Again, we're talking about inclusion drives innovation. So being able to build diverse teams gives us the ability to be innovative and to really go beyond what we can do. I don't like to work with a bunch of me's. I want to make sure that my teams are diverse. So I appreciate it. If you guys have any questions or you'd like to talk about the topic or you have some input, that'd be great. I think neurodiversity is really awesome, and I'm always excited to learn more. Thank you.